how did you come up with this idea of essentially 3 books in one, of merging these 3 different, usually separate genres, to create what ends up, in my view, being a very intimate and personal account of your engagement with Du Fu and your engagement with China. Another thing I haven't mentioned, for those of you who haven't seen the book, it's full of beautiful illustrations, both maps and images of the different places that Du Fu traveled to and that Michael followed him to. So you get a sense of place that also grounds the narrative. Anyway, so where did the idea come from? Because from my experience, it's extremely novel.
Well, as I said, we old media hacks reproduce our old tricks, don't we? And I've made quite a few films over the years, as journey films. And sometimes we've handled really big historical themes, like the Spanish conquest of the New World, for instance. One of the best series we ever made, which went to most countries, on the conquistadors. The focus of each of the films was a journey. Cortes to Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, Orellana in Amazonia, 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝘁 across Southern America, the United States of America. A journey is a very good format for telling a story, and on one level, that's the reason. But of course, it wouldn't be possible were it not for the fact that Du Fu's own life, from the moment his world collapsed, he sets off on a journey. In the end, he gives up on any hope of having preferment in the capital and the imperial family. He gets his family together and his kids, and they have a cart and his favorite old horse that he writes a wonderful poem about. My dear old horse, you've been with us for so long, you've been so patient, gorgeous poem about his horse. And they set off like one of those World War II epics, like, do you remember the Silver Sword? Families desperately trekking away from the disasters on the Russian front to escape. And they travel westwards, and they then travel, they try and hang out in the valleys around Qingzhou and the borders of Gansu for a winter, but it's so terrible and the war comes there. And then they go over the mountains into Sichuan and nearly starve to death, and terrifying ordeals, all of which he writes poetry about. They take refuge in Chengdu for quite a while, a couple of years or so. He borrows land and builds a thatched cottage himself, like most Chinese gentlemen. He was quite good at practical things, planting things, harvesting things. But it's a family living on the edge of starvation. And then they're driven on by the Tibetan invasion of Chengdu, and he goes down the gorges, the Yangtze gorges, in a little boat, still with his family and his kids, although hand-to-mouth existence, begging, cadging off people. And they spend a couple of years living in the Yangtze gorges. And actually, this is one of the things that I tried to do, is that, as you will know, the Three Gorges Dam has destroyed the landscape of the Yangtze gorges. The water's 500 feet deeper than it was in Du Fu's day. But I searched out the wonderful hand-tinted photographs from 100 years ago, some of them 150 years ago, to show what the landscape was like when he lived there. So you can actually have a caption which says, Du Fu's cottage was up on the right-hand side behind the pagoda, or even the fisherman, these beautiful poems about the fisherman's songs echoing over the gorges, and you've got these. So that helped bring to everybody's imagination what he actually saw. I mean, the 400 poems he wrote in the Yangtze gorges are, by general consent, the greatest that he wrote. And in the book, I've tentatively offered this suggestion that maybe with really great artists like Shakespeare and other writers, but even possibly musicians like Bach and Beethoven, towards the end of your life, your mastery of your medium is so great that you almost depart from the normal syntactical relations and grammatical connections and go into a world which is very taxing for the reader, but is, brilliant. And I made comparisons there with some Western writers. But the gorges he obviously loved the gorges, and many of the poems, he was a night walker, which a number of great writers are in the literary history, where you stay awake at night and you're watching the changing colour in the sky as dawn comes and the snow on the mountains. And some of these, he rents a room in on the battlements of 𝗱𝗃𝗀𝗀, where the family's staying up in the hills nearby. And this, for example, is called A Night in the Tower, where he stayed, rather than going home, he stayed in the town. And he's watching this great river of stars. In Zen Buddhism and in Chinese mythology, the river of stars, visible in the currents of the river, becomes this vast circulatory system of life in which humankind just have their own part. And this is the poem. In the evening of the year, yin and yang hurry the shortening daylight. On the sky's edge, frost and snow, clear in the cold of night. Drums and horns of the fifth watch give notes both strong and sad. In the three gorges, the river of stars, reflections stirring, shaking, weeping in the wilderness. How many families know of war and loss? The people's songs rise from the fishermen and the woodcutters. The tales of sleeping dragon and leaping horse, the old heroes who have turned to dust. All word of events in the human world lost in these vast silent spaces. So that's in his Zen mode, contemplating the universe. The gorges becomes a really, really important part of his life. And though they push on, in a desperate attempt perhaps, still by a river, maybe hoping he could in the end get home. Maybe there's something in him, he hoped he would get back to the old family estate, which was now overgrown and ruined near Luoyang. It would have been a long journey to do so, but he sails down the Yangtze to Lake Dongting, but his health worsens, he had asthma, malaria, all kinds of problems, and he dies near Pinjiang in 770, so he wasn't yet, what's that, 712 to 770, so he wasn't yet 60, but he writes of himself as a very old man now, is the way he feels, Mm-hmm. And he died in obscurity. People who encountered him and for whom he wrote occasional verse, for example, all could see that he was a truly great poet, but he died in obscurity. It's about a generation or so later that somebody writes an account of him saying there was nobody like him since the dawn of time. He's just the greatest. And by then, only a small number of his poems had been collected together in a manuscript edition. It's all before printing, of course. The first printed text that we've got that's dated is 868, so a century after his death. And then a great manuscript edition of most of his poetry was published in the 10th, 11th century, early 11th century, and then printed soon after. And from then on, he's tended to be seen as conscious of the country almost.